So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and it's an honor also being at this fantastic new building. And when I was looking for the memory stick for my presentation, I noticed what mess I have in my rucksack. And then it comes to my mind, when I'm with my wife, she always carries a key. She has a handbag. But when she tries to find the keys, she's digging and digging and digging and can't find the keys. It's all women and handbags. But I see me having the rucksack is just the same thing. It's hard to find things. Okay, so I will speak about mainly material that is from my grandparents. And they traveled a lot in China, in particular in the southwest of China, but also here in Shanghai. And a little bit, what is history? I mean, of course, we read history in our history books, and we know about the First World War, Second, and so on. If you're in China, you read some other historical reflections. And but at the end, it's of course, it's our own life, our grandparents' life, and their grandparents' life, and their memory that carries a lot of what is history, as it has been lived by ourselves, by our families and their relatives. And since there's lots of material in photos, is of course, we have a saying in Sweden that one picture says more than 100 words. So maybe that's I can transpose and hope you can enjoy some of the photos that were made 120 years ago in China. So let's see how this works. Actually, I gave a similar talk last year in Berlin. There was an exhibition with photos from my grandparents at the State Library of Berlin. And it came to my mind, the house I was living outside, you have this, what you call in German, Stolpersteine. And these are in bronze put into the street of Jewish people who were forced to live where they lived in Berlin, to memorize some of to memorize what has been done unjust towards the Jewish people in Germany, and not to forget. So this, just outside the house I lived, I noticed those two. But what I noticed, that they fled to China in 1939. So in this fashion, they survived the war, most likely, and were not killed. And of course, if you've been in Shanghai, and I visited a couple of years ago, you know the Jewish Museum in Shanghai, and there's some 30,000 people who survived thanks to hospitality of people in Shanghai receiving those. And it was Shanghai belonged, I think there were only 2 communities in the world that received refugees from Jewish refugees from Germany, because all around the world they said, no, we don't want more refugees. Of course, it's very relevant in our times, where we have many crises worldwide and many refugees. And it's also somewhat, of course, related to my family, that my grandfather was what you call half Jewish, and the same with my grandmother. So their grandparents were of Jewish origin. So, but let's go on a little bit. So this is actually the bookshelf of my sister when she was still alive. And you see these are wooden figurines. And you recognize, of course, immediately the origin, that they were made in China. And this was one of the first impressions of me being a child looking at those wooden small figurines. We thought very strange. You carry people in this kind of, chairs. And here you have this cart. And particularly this fascinated me as a boy. You see, I mean, there's a guy, and with a saw, they saw him in 2 pieces. Okay? You see that? And as a boy, I really imagined myself, they go with this saw through my entire body. Oh, how does this feel? So it was a very vivid, I could say, my first pictures or impression of China when I was 5, 6, 7 years old. I like to look at these figures. But as you see here, this cart, you see the pig is transported on this cart. And you see it's exactly the same cart as this one. Okay? So this is now a photo from my grandparents. And it's a photo how farmers, they transport their goods to the market somewhere in Sichuan. I don't know where. And it's taken maybe around 1905, 1907. So it's 120 years back, roughly, when this photo was taken, still most likely in the Qing dynasty. So coming a little bit to my talk is levels of memories. We have many different levels in our mind, in what we read and what we encounter. And I want to give a little bit also historic background of that time. For you, maybe you read in your history books, and me too. And then present a little bit notes and pictures from my grandfather and grandmother's time. Travels up how the, in particular, Yangtze River and their large travel from Yunnan to Shanghai. I speak a little about pandas, maybe a little bit about globalization, probably not so much. This was not erased properly, but this is more or less the outline of my talk. Also memory of my sister, and thanks to her that we have these photos, because my grandfather, of course, had many boxes with photos and notes and so on. It was in my father's house. My father moved to stay and said, oh God, what shall I do? All the boxes, I'm going to throw it away. My sister came by and passed by and said, oh, no, let's keep it. I want to have a look at it. And this was even glass photos. That time you took the photo, it was a glass on a glass. With silver, and so she saved the memory of it, and after she worked then, and there was a book published by her with the photos, and she made eventually also a documentary. This is one of the books that contains not all of the photos, but quite a number of them, and I think it's almost finished now in terms of, you can't, it's not difficult, it's difficult to get hold of it, not many copies left. Maybe opportunity to make a new print, and it has many valuables, both text and it was made by my sister in collaboration with Sichuan Press. So a little bit about their life. My grandparents, so Fritz Max Weiss is my grandfather, is my grandmother. It's her maiden name, and you see this name is not really the same as this one, and it's because his father was Swiss. And he had some problems with the Swiss authority, so he moved to Germany, and he wanted to change his name into German name. Weiss is more German than Wiss, and Wiss actually Swiss name. And then my father, after Second World War, he changed back to Swiss name, so I'm back to the origin. But it's the same name, and the spelling is of course different. So he was born still in Zurich in Switzerland, and died in Heidelberg. I was 3 years. I still have some faint memories of him. He started 1895 in the customs service for the Qing dynasty. Actually, he worked in Qingdao. And at that time, the customs service, the Chinese customs service, were run by international cooperation, but under British rule. So the British were taking care of the Chinese custom, going in and out, taking care of the money. And this is where my grandfather got job. He realized very soon, working, he had to calculate all the number, 1 penny custom there, 1 penny there, that he made an error in the calculations. There were 3 pence missing, and his subordinate said, come on, where you have to find the error. And he tried to find, he couldn't find the error. So then his boss said, you are really not good for anything. So my grandfather early decided, that's not the place I'm going to stay. At the same time, he was always very much interested in Chinese language and Chinese culture. So he had studied Chinese already in Germany. So when he came to China, he was quite fluent in Chinese already. So he got instead a job at the Foreign Affairs Office, of the German Foreign Office. So he switched. He only stayed 1 year there. So he started to switch into the German Foreign Office and became an acting consul in Chongju, Chongqing, 1905. So pretty young, one of the youngest consul at that time. And then he was full consul 1911 in Yunnan in this time. He worked for the Versailles Treaty. He went to Africa. My father's actually born in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. He went to Havana, Caracas, Asunción, but 1934 he understood what was happening in Germany, so he retired early. Due to that he was half Jew, he would have been thrown out of the service anyhow. That is his name he had in China, his Chinese name. My grandmother, you see, is almost 10 years younger, 12 years exact, born in Berlin, and she lived, of course, much longer. I have many, many memories with her, and published many things in different books, so she really was a writer, you could say. The book of her in Chinese, Dealing of China, that is published in English, is this Plum Blossom Kailin, 1958, but the book we have here in our hands is the book she wrote first, and I think it's one of her best books in general, and in particular on China, of little boy, Chinese boy Li, which I read as a teenager maybe, and which I was very much fond of, and also made many impressions on myself. As you have seen the title here, okay. This is the original version. We printed this book now, is very, very valuable in Germany. It was printed in leather and with hand drawings by Orlik, which was a well-known painter at that time. And it costs a couple of thousands renminbi. It's difficult, but you can still find it in antiquariat if you search for it. This is a picture of my grandparents. So this is my grandfather. This is actually, you could say, the picture of their wedding picture, you could say, when they got married, 1910. As mentioned, my grandfather was very much interested in Chinese literature. So this is a book he translated into German from Chinese language. This book unfortunately became not a success. Maybe didn't make the best choice. I don't know, whatever. So, but we have a couple of those copies in our memory. And it's said that in older age he had this. He had an old Chinese coat that he put on and liked to study Chinese literature and the philosophers from China. This is a picture of him when he lived in China, an early one. You see, he loved Wagner. He played the piano. So each time he traveled, he always carried the piano with us. This was at that time you could do that, and it's a kind of typical picture you may recognize. This one I can't tell what it says, but you may be able. Longevity. Okay, longevity. Yeah. So that's what we all wish to have. My grandmother kept diaries while living in China. So this is from 1911, the year she came to China. And almost every day she made notes. And of course, this is a very valuable study for historians. It's all digitalized at the German State Library. And you can actually find on the web and download and find this materials. Of course, written in German. But if you're fluent in German, it's as mentioned, worth for historian to study. This is how she wrote. It's a nice handwriting. I can read it anyhow. And it's actually, what she writes here is 5 minutes before midnight, according to the Yunnan Fu clock tower, did she see the light of the world. This is how her daughter was born. So she gave birth to 2 children while being in China. One was born 1912, the other 1914, and the other 1916. And she didn't know the name yet. Apparently it became Jutta at the end. So this is my aunt being formed here. So this is part of the material we saw here. Of course, the conditions of my grandparents coming to China was, of course, the conditions of the colonial time. That the imperial power started, the Treaty of Nanjing after the First Opium War, that give huge rights to the foreign powers to enter China and have large rights to live here, and even the rights to be in the judiciary. They were part of the judge system and so on. And this is, you all very much familiar with all this time, and it was 1898, actually the year after my father came to Qingdao, that it was taken over as a German concession. He experienced the Boxer Treaty. He was there during that time. And you know, of course, that China had to pay a huge fine, and they paid until December 1941. And first, 1943, we have the treaty between France, Britain, that is China returning all concession and extra territorial rights. So it's interesting, particularly, that the judicial system in China during Qing Dynasty was very, very different, of course, what we experienced from Europe. And in particular, how you view what is a law. In China, the law was codified and interpreted by the state or the judge, more or less. It was not an independent judiciary, it was a county magistrate acted as a representative of justice. So it's the same person, the detectives, the judge, and the jury made all decisions. This profession did not exist. Normally, the prisoner, they were treated until they confessed, and you could also change some punishments for cash. And if you had some good exam from university, you passed Gaokai and entered Jiao-Tong, then you had a little better treatment by the judge. But it was, of course, in this capacity, this is as a judge, my grandfather had to participate in trials and also judge many events where foreigners were engaged. These are another two photos which made it not so nice to look at. It's from Guangdong, 1901, the pottery market. And this is how justice was made rather swiftly. And as a foreigner consul, you were many times more or less forced to visit those and participate in this. And you see they all have their head bowed, and here's someone standing with a sword. And if you look at the next photos, you see the heads have all rolled on the earth. And this was also for me as a boy, these photos were very exciting to look at. I could not understand. I was thinking many times, what's happening when your head is off? Can you still walk? And so on. So but this is a more pleasant photo. It says goodbye party. So my grandfather, he stayed in Qingdao. He came then to Shanghai, actually, then to Guangzhou. And he had many teachers, and he had a very good relation to many of his Chinese colleagues. And of course, they were partly his teachers, improving his Chinese language, but he also socialized with the Chinese community. How did you travel at that time? So when my grandfather went to Shanghai, it was 1899, I told you. He started from Marseille, 9 November. And then he came to Port Said, Egypt, then to Aden, little down the coast. And then he arrived in Ceylon, Singapore, Hong Kong, 13. So it took more than 1 month, this kind of travel at that time. And these were actually different carriers. It's like you go from Shanghai to Beijing and you change the flight in Beijing. These were freight carriers which had to stop, and we had to get more coal into the ship and so on. It was not diesel boat, diesel engine, everything was coal driven. You had people shuffling coal into the boats. And of course, these were then upper class people. They had a very nice time, very nice dinners all the time, and you socialized and you drank and you eat a lot of good food while traveling. And at that time it started, you could say this is the first period of globalization. Trade at that time was larger percent-wise than 5, 6, 7 years back. It was a huge trade between England, entire China. The trade was enormous in terms of percentage of GDP. So it took more than 100 years to come back. This is, of course, here are the boats. This is a PO line, different the UK line, and these were the way people traveled. And it became the first, you could say, tourists came at that time starting. As a representative for Germany, you had to look at certain conditions. And for example, these were contract laborers. They were called Kuli, and they were to be shipped to Malaysia to work in the mines. A picture 1901, and my grandfather was sent there to check the condition. There were many complaints. Of course, these were terrible conditions. You could say very close to slavery. These people were many times, could even be sold by their parents who needed money or another had come in bad condition and needed to take this kind of very tough work where they were shipped. And my grandfather had to inspect and see how were the condition and then report back to the authorities in, I think this was then in Shanghai. This was a huge trade, contracted labor trade. It's worth almost maybe up to 500,000 Chinese, so-called coolies, were imported to different Western. And in principle, you could say the transcontinental railroad were built by Chinese laborers. It was not. At that time also was a huge change in how Chinese people were treated abroad. Before it was really like a huge welcome, but then you could say a strong racism start to permeate in the United States and then also in other countries. That, I mean, it was a quote by Grove Cleaver, United States President, that the Chinese are an element ignorant of our constitution and laws, impossible of assimilation with our people, and dangerous to our peace and welfare. So it's good to remember that in today's talk sometimes what was the situation more than 100 years ago. This is now a photo from 1905 when my grandfather started to be acting consul. It's in Chengdu. You see these are the representatives of the Qing dynasty, but they are still sitting in the front, and you have the chains probably, this is most likely the governor of Sichuan, which is appointed by the Qing dynasty. He, at that time, he doesn't know that his life will not continue much longer. And but you see that the foreign representatives are in the back row. They're not sitting in the front, so they still have a very respectful attitude towards the officials from the Qing dynasty. This is the Governor Feng, and as mentioned, he then became a victim of the national uprising a couple of years later. Going back to Berlin, so my grandfather, when he came to China, 1899, there were no holidays. He got once holiday 4 weeks, but in 4 weeks you can't travel back and forth to Germany. So actually he took the opportunity to travel to Japan and enjoyed the hot bath in Japan. Was surprised that people bathed naked at that time, both women and men together. And this was for him very shocking. But anyhow, he enjoyed his time, and then he came back. The first time he came back was 12 years later, so 1911. And how do you meet, how do you marry someone at that time? Not easy. I mean, of course, he was in China, but he didn't meet many German ladies. And but he met a cousin of, let's say, a kind of uncle cousin to Hedwig, my grandmother. And he told, well, I know family in Berlin, the Sonnenburgs, why don't you visit her? She's a kind of person that likes adventure. So maybe there's an opportunity. So and of course he told then the father of her that I have a very nice guy I met in Shanghai. So maybe your family wants to receive him for a dinner and can see what happens. So he came to a dinner, was invited, they sit beside it as he told of China, and she was very excited. She was a sports lady. She liked sports, she played tennis, horseback riding. She was a person that was adventurous. But she also had a cousin that she was in love with, that was in Africa, and she dreamed of traveling to Africa, not China. But still China sounded good. Her cousin hasn't responded per letter, so she was a little bit undecided, but she gave insight, okay, let's marry. So they got engaged, and but then 2 days later, she thought, no, I don't want to marry. So she broke up engagement. And my grandfather was a little bit desperate what to do. My grandmother traveled to another relative in Cologne, but he followed after, come again, wrote letters, please, please, why not? And she spoke then to the brother of the cousin, is maybe your brother interested in me? I mean, I haven't heard him. He's in Africa, hasn't responded to my letters. I don't think he's interested in you. And then my grandmother decided, okay, let's marry. Well, you see, so only 2-3 days, 1 week, and you were married. And it's the same with her sister, actually. So there were 3 sisters. And eventually, I think, I would say the Mary was not unhappy. But, I mean, happiness and personal was different at that time. So at that time, the parents were just happy if the girls were married. So she decided, okay, let's go to China, and this is a picture on the boat. It's now on the adventurous travel, and this is now 1911, and he has become consul, so of course he has a good position, and he promised her to show India and all kind of places, and of course she says, let's somewhat excited. This is away from, you travel then up the Yangtze. I come back to this a little later. These are some photos from Shanghai harbor at that time when they arrived. And this is the Bund at Shanghai, a little different now. You see small, big boats, and of course they enter there with their steamship and walk around a couple of days. And she said in her published later, but this is what she wrote in her diary. It was tepid, still evening. We traveled along the brightly lit Bund, one behind the other in nimble rickshaws. Everything appeared before me as if in a dream. The tooting of the cars, the ring of electric trams sounded to my ears just as if I was at home in Berlin. But alongside that unusual view for me, that of wagons which were pulled by half-naked, breathless people, brown-skilled Indian policemen with bright red turbans and shining black sideburns on the streets of the English concession, equipage harnessed by ponies, and a coachman with a long flying queue dressed in white seat at the front seat. So it's just her impression of Shanghai at that time. So she was very open. It is, I would say, still a nice picture. I should mention when it said pony here, that my grandfather, when he lived in Shanghai, he had a pony and he was riding. That was the way you transport yourself. This is now when they went up the Yangtze River. It's the harbor in Shanghai, and you could go with a steamboat. The steamboat, you can travel up to Yichang. And then, due to the rapids, you could not get further. This was the last stop you could come with the boat. Here, my grandfather proudly lifts his German flag on the boat. They're traveling up Yangtze, and now is when you enter the rapids. And you see this lovely Zhongke. I think this is one of the most beautiful pictures of the Yangtze River and the gorges you're entering. And of course, you understand that this is not coming back. Even if you go with a steamboat, the silence that you experience and this wave gives you an impression of a time that has passed bound, but also a beauty of these boats sailing into the gorges. This is another photo. Now you come close to the rapids and you see the small paths that have been dug into the cliffs at the side, and you see this mighty stream and how small the boat appears towards the streams. So these were the travel they did from Yuqing, Chongqing to Chengdu. And you start in November. This is now, I go back a little bit in time. This was when my grandfather traveled up, and not together with my grandfather, but the time hasn't changed in these 6-7 years. The way he traveled is, he received actually a letter that his father has died after 6 weeks. So he was not present when his father died. And his father, when he said goodbye to his son, 1899, he didn't know whether, of course, they would see each other again. So he was traveling 24 boxes. And the medicine he called this was a champagne, 100 bottles, 1/2 liter champagne. This was very important at this time when you're Westerner. It was kind of part of your medicine. And it took almost more than 2 weeks coming to Guizhou. And then 13 December, more than 1 month later, you come to Chongqing. So you traveled like 20 kilometers a day. And then they left from Chongqing with 3 liters, arriving in January 4 in Chengdu. So he had a pedometer, so he calculates the speed all the time. So traveling from Yucheng to Chengdu, this is quite a journey compared to our time today. And if you get a letter from Germany at that time, it took 70 days, and parcel would take almost a year. This now going back, a picture from the rapids in the Yangtze. So when you entered the rapids, boats stopped here in the beginning because then you need trailers to pull you up the Yangtze River. That was necessary. And now you see how the rapids look like, and of course they don't look very pleasant. and it's, you could say, even frightful. Here's another photo how the rapids really can pull apart a boat, depending if you are. And this is text from my grandmother. You could already hear from the distance the thundering sound of the rapids, mixed in the muffled drumming, the singing of the trekkers. So they had to pull up the boat, these kind of very dangerous rapids up the Yangtze to reach the harbor in Chongqing. The way they were pulled is these kind of, they hired, I mean, when you stopped at this part where the rapids start, you hired your gang of trackers, and my grandmother saw, oh, sorry, I got very fast. Our 20 wrecks scrambled up the narrow cliff path, giving out loud shouts as they carried the mighty bamboo ropes. It were bamboo rope on the little loops above their shoulders. You see, they have the loops with their hack to the shoulders, and then they pull by hand up the boats to rapid. And it was, of course, a very dangerous and very hard work, and not very well paid. This is a picture of these trekkers waiting for the job. And I think this person is just smiling into the camera, looking that he's still alive today. There's no shy, he has a child with him here guarding. And they all hope, of course, having some work to do that can support their living. This is a boy that inspired my grandmother writing her novel. So also children worked. I think the face of the boy is really speaking with looking at you and wondering how will my day be today. A mixture of shyness, expectation, worries, but also matureness, grown up. Here you see the trackers, some of them are even naked, and you see it's tough, no shoes, and run up the wall, and you see as my grandmother writes, the men do their utmost, they desperately grip the stony ground with their hands, they're singing, which just now echoed from the gorges opposite becomes a kind of hissing, a hoarse cry, until the lead singer finds a rhythm and pounds it out, and whether we can see whether it works. No, let's see. Can we get it running maybe on the computer? Can you get it, how you get it clicking here? Yeah. Now with the mouse, yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is recording from 1910, 210 years back. And you ask us how was this done, and my grandfather was quite interested in technology, so he brought a lot of stuff with him. So this is the Edison phonograph, and these are the original waltz that he recorded, and all together like 13 or 14 of songs from the trackers, but also from the minority were recorded their songs, and they're at the German museum and in ethnographic museum in Berlin, and one can find all these songs there. And there has also been a PhD work on the songs where this has been part of it, because it's rather rare. There are not many recordings from that time in China, so it's a very valuable ethnographic collection of that time. This is another, and again, I mean, they're still, I would say, happy. They enjoy their work, part-time at least, and looking into the camera. And I'm fascinated that my grandparents took these photos of, you could say, normal people, because at that time it was still that you view yourself as a Westerner much above all others. So they had this very open attitude towards the other culture. This photo is, I think, one of the most artistic, very, very beautiful ones. The symmetry of the boats. I mean, this is a rowing boat, small rowing boat, where they go somewhere, probably hunting. They liked hunting a lot, and they pass them on, and you see somewhere the opening of the water, and the figure of with the crosses, with the row. So I like this a lot. I have it at home in my study hanging. And these were glass plates still, so on glass. This is a picture now of my grandmother and grandfather when they take a small boat for rowing. Maybe it's the same photo on the other side. He probably puts a camera somewhere here with a, self-supporting system. And you see they enjoy their coffee. And of course, they had, in one way, a very comfortable life because they could travel, took much stuff with them. But still, it's not, quite adventurous still, I would say. And this is now one nice building you see. It's the Bell Tower Temple Wanshin. And this is one of the course. Another nice side of these photos is preservation of some of the buildings. That how do they look like and how were they embedded in the natures or in the city of that time. Again, the Yangtze River, and of course the beauty is amazing. It's lovely seeing the opening and the donkeys sailing into the opening of the Yangtze River. This is now the harbor in Chongqing. Now again, I mean, you would not recognize it today. The donkeys arrive here, all the pack, it's repacked and so on. And they arrived in principle at the eve of the National Revolution. And 1911, when they came to Yicheng, actually they got a cable from the German embassy in Peking that they should not go upstreams because it's dangerous. All the missionaries, all the foreigners are come downstream because now it's very dangerous to go there. And my grandmother writes in her diary, but there's still women living in China, so I'm a woman, why should I not be able to go upstream? So she insisted, and her grandfather, there was 2 days where there was silence, so they decided to go upstreams to Chongqing, even though the revolution just started. And as mentioned, in the next couple of weeks, the regime in China and the entire life would change totally. Now it's, of course, very different. It's 4 days, 3 nights, Chongqing, and a different price, yeah. So this is Chongqing, the city gate at that time. I mean, you had these huge city gates, all the tower, bell tower. And of course, in principle, she describes also when eventually the national troops arrived to the city, that in principle, they are still fighting from the Qing dynasty, the army, but it's most of the soldiers there just leave the generals, and it's at the end not a large battle. This is the life of people. You see, you carry, of course, everything by hand up the steep stairs to the city of Chongqing, and the gates in the evening they're closed, open in the morning. Nighttime it's not open. And there are, of course, many interesting stories told by my grandmother about that time of the National Revolution in China. This is a picture of a family living in Chongqing, and you see, of course, it's not the one-child policy, so families had many children at that time, not surprising. But still, it's also they all look a little bit suspicious or open into what is this foreigner doing here. Another photo is the street scene of Chongqing, the stairs at the harbor, and it's, of course, life is a different, but it gives a glimpse how life was 120 years back in China. This is a typical reception at the embassy. So this is, you see, the new generation of officers. They have been educated in Japan. They're very strict like this. And you see, and of course, it's already my grandfather wrote to his embassy already 1907. After speaking with some of the officers, he said that the Qing dynasty will not last very long. He was very much aware of that. And Of course, you have a drink always. You have this whatever, probably maybe red wine or what, people from MSc, and a typical reception where then discuss. And since he was fluent in China, he had, of course, could build a net of contacts and so on. Another that was very popular, selling sugar cane. So you chew on the sugar cane on the Chongqing wall. So sweet, we always love to eat something sweet. And that was at that time the way you had a small, delicious thing in between. Maybe good for teeth also. Another seat in Haitang, also screen here, some restaurants, tea houses, things. It looks, I mean, it's of course, the streets are maybe somewhat muddy, some animals running around, and it's dense. My grandfather started a German school also in Chengdu. This is the first group of students. I'm not sure whether, probably it's possible to identify a few here. Some of the names are written here. I don't know how really identify, but so if you have a relative that has where the grandparents or great grandparents have been at a German school, you can look whether you can identify him or her, whatever, on that photo. This is how my grandmother traveled. She hated that, really hated to be in the litter, but this is what you had to do. So when she visited other families and tried to have some conversation with the ladies, it's that was the way she had to be transported. But she also comments, I mean, shops in the commercial streets are very handsome, and the shopkeepers understand how to arrange the luxury goods. And this has not changed 120 years or today. We do the same thing. This is now 1912. I think the soldiers, 5th Company, Middle Army, and you see now it's a little bit different, but I mean, you see the weapons may not be very impressive, but it's a part of the chain. You see all the shoes. It's not everybody has shoes. It's in a state, it was the state of the army at that time. Another scene of Chengdu. Now Chengdu was a street scene. We lived both in Chengdu and Chongqing. It was in between. The embassy, I think, was allowed to be in Chengdu only, but they had, of course, tried to establish, let's say, the German relation in both cities. Another picture is, of course, this is a picture from the film my sister made, and you see these are the Chinese shoes, ladies' shoes. And this I also noticed as a child. It was fascinating. These small shoes. How was it possible? I could not imagine. My grandmother, well, they had to bind the feet. What bind? How is it possible? I mean, the shoes, they don't fit in here. It was unimaginable for me, but very, very fascinating. Actually, the movie, my sister made a documentary 15 years ago in Sichuan, and the name of the movie is Chinese Shoes. She takes this and shows this is now an elderly lady. This lady is more than 100 years old. My sister meets her, and their parents still want to bind her feet to be beautiful, looking beautiful. Of course, women couldn't walk. And my grandmother told me when she went to a tea party, all the ladies laughed at her because she had so big feet. That was, and she felt a little bit ashamed towards these small, tiny feet. How was it possible? Well, it's actually some X-ray and how a foot were deformed for women at that time. By binding, it was pressed together and made this small shape, and and then they could fit into this shoe. This is some X-ray, and actually this doctor, he asked, you see how the toes grow into the foot, and it of course was painful to walk. This is a movie from my sister. So it's a documentary, the Chinese shoes. It's actually they speak a lot of Chinese. It's actually English subtitles, if you can come across of it. As mentioned, my grandmother was very adventurous, and a big deal was at that time to explore other regions outside Sichuan, in particular the southwest, where the minority Yi were living, and he had a great interest. And that time it was not allowed for foreigners to enter that area. partly the central government had no full control over that area. It was kind of considered as a wild area, a tribal area. And so this was one of the reasons, and it was not uncommon that foreigners were killed when they entered this area. But anyhow, my grandfather, in secrecy, first time he was stopped. The police, they got to know his plans, so he was stopped, he could not enter. But the second time he succeeded and traveled, and this is one of the maps. He was very interested in drawing maps. He was, you could say, a little bit of an explorer also, and trying, of course, there is some military aspect always to this, that you try to study other countries. And this is now some photos from this travel. This is a picture along the Anning River at Lugu, and they traveled on horseback into this area of the Yi. And this is a photo of children, how they guard the oxen along the river. And another way how life are. It's a farm site in these years. And this is now when they visit the minority Nuoso Yu, how you call us in Liangshan. And he got friend to, this is probably the a kind of lord of that area. And so my father got friendly with him, and they had a very good relation. And he wanted, of course, have the gun from my father, but they did some exchange trading. And this is now a book that they published from the book, The Travels. Here are some which have been, oh, sorry, sometimes jumping. Sorry, it goes very fast. So when you press the wrong button. So this is from the publication. This is now a prison. They called them Lolo at that time. The name of the Uso was Lolo. And actually my aunt, as a second name, my grandparents were also fascinated that they called her Lolo as a second name. So her name is Alice Lolo Weiss. And this is one taken prison as hostage in exchange probably by the, and of course they had not very, this are the guard station at the border between what is, they could say, the region of the Lolos and what was where the Chinese imperial power had protection. This is now a picture from the women, and also my grandmother fascinated. They were very proud women. They had a very high standing in the tribes, and you see also the way they look into the camera is very open, and you feel the power in particular of that lady. I mean, that is strength in that photo. She is not afraid of anything. It's a picture from the children, also in this area, and there's several pictures. This is another boy also looking very nice. It's probably the son of the Lord from this region as an encounter. Also very, very nice photo to my mind. And this is a little bit a story when they stayed overnight in the tent, of course, my grandparents, and they also recorded the songings and then played the songing. And of course, the tribe were fascinated. So later that evening, as we were about to go to sleep, a messenger came to our tent and asked us to come once more. The mistress wanted to hear the wonderful singing and talking machine. Among the Lolo, the women also have their say. Inside the house, the whole neighborhood was gathered. A young Vatse with a beautiful, clear voice was singing. His repertoire was much larger than we had expected. Lullabies, songs for fighting, for guarding cattle, songs, wedding. And when, after recording, we played them back, all the faces glowed with pleasure and gave out a hearty laughter I had never heard before them Chinese. It was almost midnight when we retired, and for a long time we could hear their voices. They lay down by the fire, wrapped in their coats. We felt as if we had received a glimpse into the soul of this strange tribe. Aren't songs sung by everyone? Not the expression of a people's soul. So this was, Vatsi was a Chinese name for slave serve. And this is what she wrote in this. She wrote, published in the, you could say, a journal for geography. And of course, these songs are preserved and in this, as mentioned, in the museum. And they are maybe the most valuable, because that time there exists nothing from the Ui or Lolos that you could listen to. A little bit, of course, my grandfather collected many items, and this is now in different museums. This is now a collection in a museum in Germany. And of course, in this fashion, I mean, much of this has been preserved, and whether it's fair or not. So anyhow, this is one of the covers, the Lolo carried, and this is so-called the Weiss or Weiss collection that is in the museum. Some is in Munich, some is in Cologne, and some is in Berlin. This now, after Chengdu, Chongqing, they went to Yunnan. So this is now where my aunt Jutta is born, and she played with another girl. So she's born now in Kunming in Yunnan. And of course, the children, what do they play? I mean, nowadays they have the small cart they play. I mean, the girls, but that time there were no carts. So you put them in the litter instead. Okay, this is how a small girl played at that time, a different way. And but as you may know, 1970, China entered the First World War together with the English and the French, of course, hoping to get back some of their concessions. And China declared war against Germany. So they had to leave Yunnan and travel back to, of course, you may wonder why to Shanghai, but in principle, I can show later a picture. This was the way they were forced to travel. So they had then the newborn child. It was not even 1 year. He is a maid helping my grandmother. This is my grandfather. And then you had, of course, people helping carry. So there's a huge luggage, and they went also guarded by this. And you see here when you are in Kunming, there was a railroad at that time very close to Hanoi. But because Hanoi was French, they were not allowed to take that railway. But they had to go from Kunming through the land up to, now I don't see where is Chongqing, somewhere up here where they had to travel by land, which is quite a distance, and it's not easy to do this with the small children. But this was the way it was, and this is the description. So it's 3,000 kilometers from Yunnan to Shanghai, and this is the entire travel in giving the days from 21st of March till April 19, pretty fast still. And how they do from my grandfather's note in his notebook, how they go from one day to the other day. This was the way it looked like. So partly traveled, partly riding, and guarded by soldiers from the army, not to escape. And I mean, it was part of it. So it's another stop. They stopped many times in temples, staying overnight, before they could go on travel. As mentioned, my grandmother loved riding, and also this is why her daughter very early on learned riding. So she's not really 3 years old, but she's already starting to sit on a horseback together with my grandmother, and sometimes alone. And this was a preferred way my grandmother transported. It's now when they eventually entered Chongqing, the harbor, and now shipping and the land travel is over, and they have to travel downwards to Yang, which is, of course, more easy than upstreams. Later on, they went actually from Shanghai to San Francisco by boat, and because they were not allowed to enter France or England. And in the United States, they were put in a train that was closed because the United States had already entered the war. So it was a closed train set from San Francisco to New York, and then from New York by boat to Germany. So the entire travel took a couple of months to be back to Germany. My grandfather entered the commission for the Versailles Treaty. He is seen here, and was part of the negotiation. Of course, you could say this Versailles Treaty was the start of a new world order, and also a new war later, not much later. It's nice, and I checked a little bit, and this would be a nice trip to make at this time. And nowadays, Kunming to Shanghai, 10 hours, and the largest distance you have. You can be proud of your railway system. It is fantastic. Little bit about pandas. All interesting. Of course, you all know this animal. This is a picture from an exhibition in Berlin. And why in Berlin? This is a quote from my grandfather. As I by chance discovered a white fur at the dealer and bought it for a small sum. The head of the Zoological Institute got quite ecstatic when I wrote to him about the bargain. because the panda was very little known. Also, if you check old Chinese literature, there are no paintings of pandas or descriptions in the literature. It was a really rare animal also in China, very shy. It's supposed to be discovered, of course, you knew it long, but in the Western literature, this is what you say, discovered by this French priest, and it became 61. And you have panda diplomacy, and it's a lovely animal. So, this is from the Berlin Zoo. They have 3 pandas. Sorry, not zoo, museum. Museum of Natural History. And 2 of the pandas are the one from my grandfather, okay? The food he bought, was shipped to Germany and then prepared. And that time they didn't really know how the panda looked like, but I think it became quite good. They thought, was it a bear? It wasn't sure whether it was a bear or not. But anyhow, so this is from the Sohm panda, and you can follow the history of those bears. This is Theodore Roosevelt, not the president, but it's his brother, and it was very popular. You went on shooting pandas, so you could, like people were shooting the lions and the elephants, so you had then advertisements in the newspaper. Here, shooting time is here, and you have these photos, proud hunters of panda bears. So it was advertised in newspaper, you'd come to China and shoot your panda. Not very popular. Okay, so this is a little bit time. What you think about is, of course, what are the important moments of history, and of course, coming back to what I spoke in the beginning, you have some very important moments for your family that reflect history at large. Like, they had to leave China now in 1970. My grandfather never returned to China, in spite he loved coming back. He hoped still that he would get an appointment to China, but he was put somewhere else. He could not decide that. But it's really what is history and what are important moments, and we all can reflect a little bit about our parents and their grandparents and how are they part of forming our history. It's really composed of the life of many individuals, and I'm happy I can share some of the little from my life of my grandparents and how they interacted. And this personal account, of course, I think gives a deeper understanding about where we stand now and where we stood not so many years back. It's just my grandparents. So I think the sense of time and personality has changed. It's a lot. When you read how they traveled and how we travel today, how we communicate, time is different today. Very, very, very different. It's probably also our young people experience this probably even more. But I think also the way, if you look at personality, of course, it's certainly, as people, we may not have changed a lot, but still the way we look upon ourselves. I made a reflection when I was 14 years old. I made a travel with my best mate in school. By bike, we were traveling 2 weeks alone through Germany and was leaving youth hostels. And now, 3 years back, I had got contact with him, and I thought, is there a photo from this journey? We only took pictures of the churches and some houses. Not a single photo of us, ourselves. So I think that is something that is very, very different today. And there is a nice homepage where actually some of the travel or some of the songs are, it's also in Chinese, actually this is English language, it's in Chinese language, reported a little bit of the travels. And this is where I want to stop, and thank you very much. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
那现在呢，就是我们现场读者朋友可以给我们的维斯教授提问，然后大家有问题的话可以举手，然后我们来进行一个问答的环节，大概15分钟左右。有读者要提问吗？
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. Very happy to hear your grandparents' story about 120 years ago. But it's very complicated emotion to hearing this story and see those pictures. And I have two questions. The first question is, what's your just now you said your reflection about this experience of our grandparents. Would you please share your in the deepest impressed idea of this experience? This is the first question. The second question is about yourself. What's your experience in China when you first visit China, and what's your how long did you spend in China, and what's your impression and changes during these years? Thank you. So much questions.
You're most welcome. Thank you for the question, and thank you also that enjoyed. I hope I have not bored you with this presentation. It's and I think your first question was how I felt about these photos. I think this is different thing. It's first of all, when I was not much interested in this at all. You see, my grandmother, of course, I loved the stories she wrote and so on, but I read maybe when I was 13, 14, 15, and then it passed away. It was through my sister that she showed the photos and discovered that. And I actually was with her when the photo exhibition was opened in Chongqing. And this kind of opened my eye. And I think the two things opened my eye. I think one is that some photos I really think have a beauty, it's artistic. Like you go to an exhibition of a well-known photographer and look. So some pictures I think really transmit the beauty of photography and life of that time. So this was, I see, one impression. And of course, the second one is, of course, seeing the faces. The faces, I think, kind of talk to me. It's like being a friend. You see, in the face, you see, look at the face, it's like looking at a friend, for me at least. I mean, you see a human face, it's friendship to me, first impression. And the third, of course, is this reflection how much things have changed in rather short time, from my grandparents' time to now. Also, you could say part of injustice that was at that time. We had injustice between powers. There will always be injustice between power, but it was tremendous at that time. And also that how the standard of living. I mean, my grandmother told that when there was famine in China, farmers sold their children. And of course, you read this in the stories. She experienced that. And this kind of changes from there to now is, of course, tremendous. This comes also to when I was being in China now. And at first, I was supposed to travel to China 1989, but then to Tiananmen Square, I could not go. So I came first together when I have a postdoc from China working with me. I came back to Beijing, I think 2002, 2001. Of course, I've been in China since 2001 to now, almost every year, maybe 1 or 2, 3 times. And you see each time a huge change. One is, of course, technology. One is, of course, how we change. But I think it's also that you meet many people that are very friendly, very open. So I think you can very good friends. So it tells you a story that we humans are we are individuals, but we all, in some way, all similar, same. That is, I would say. Yeah. Not sure I answered. I hope I answered. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Raymond, for your interesting sharing. Very interesting pictures and stories behind. Have you met and talked with your grandparents? And the second question is, where did the financial support come from when your grandparents were traveling in China?
Yes, it is 2 questions. The first is whether, as mentioned, my grandfather have some faint memories. He was also a person that liked to joke a lot. So when we were kids, I remember he did some jokes with us. I have this picture from him in my face, but I was only, with my grandmother, we spent a lot of time together. So we traveled to her with Spain, and she was driving car and so on. She had driver's license, took early on. So she is very vivid in my memory because we shared many experiences together. And I have many funny stories to tell about her and with her and so on. So now what was the next question? Sorry. Financial, yeah. Okay, the point that's also very interesting, actually. You see, when my grandfather entered both his custom service and then the consular German foreign office, he in principle did not get a salary or very little. It was his father who could support him both by equipments and things. So you had to come, when you worked in the foreign office, you had to need someone who could support you financially. But then those travels, once he was in Chengdu, this was covered by the German consulate. And I think they complained, of course, he said, I'm looking at whether there are mines, I'm looking whether there's gold or whether you can find something. He was not interested in that. He just wanted to travel and explore. But the German government would support this travel. So this was then, once he got his position, I think maybe around 1903, 1904, this kind of expectation as consulate, then he had this full support. But until you had that position, you had to rely much upon yourself. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
但是我口语不太好，需要帮我翻译一下，好吗？ 对，我想问的就是。 你的家族或者是你的祖父母在二战当中，因为主要讲的这个，你刚才讲的故事都是一战期间或者一战前后，还没有涉及到二战。我想知道有没有二战期间的什么故事呀什么的。
Yeah, so my one could say that they were very lucky. First, I mean, as mentioned, my grandfather was half Jewish, and my grandmother also. With my grandmother, it was not really obvious because you had to show, every person had to show what is called a pass of your forefathers up to fourth generation. So you could see, is your grandfather Jew, is your grandmother Jew, to see. And then you could classify quarter Jew, half Jew, three-quarter. Three-quarter was like Jewish, that you were gone. But anyhow, so he was half Jewish, and as a half Jewish person, you could go under the radar. Okay, so actually, but he didn't want to go back to Germany. The point was that he was in Latin America, 34, he stopped office, and he went to Spain, and they settled in Spain. This is why I have a Spanish, my first name is Spanish, Ramon, because they lived in Spain for some years, and my grandfather, my father, when he was a teenager, also lived in Spain, so he liked Spain a lot. So this is why I have a Spanish first name. And then around 37, it was not allowed to take money abroad from Germany. So he was standing without a salary, and he was not that rich that he could support himself. So he was forced to move back to Germany. But he tried to have his kids abroad. So my father went to Switzerland. One daughter got married in the United States. She already didn't come back to Europe. And the other daughter lived also in Switzerland. Then eventually my father had eventually to come back to Germany, even joined the army. But he was medical doctor. So he worked he studied medicine. So he was also very lucky. But in principle, so make a short story short, they survived, lived quite well. I mean, they had still a salary and so on. So they lived in Berlin in a villa. But some of their relatives, of course, died and were exported or managed, did escape to some way or the other. So many of the relatives had a tragic end, yeah.
其他读者还有问题的话，那我想我们今天活动就到这里，好吧？好，让我们再一次用掌声感谢。